literature. Our first presenter is Radat from CU, still doctoral student?
Yes.
And she will present the paper titled Politicized Nostalgia in Sarah Potter's Thinking Development. The floor is yours.
Yeah, this was the original title, which I then decided to slightly modify into politicized nostalgia, but it does testify to the focus of the work, or the two focal points. I study nostalgia, and usually it's kind of a depressing work because the kind of nostalgia I deal with is reactionary and regressive. But I was also encouraged to look into different uses of nostalgia that are more productive, at least, depending on your political positioning. So I wanted to talk about a different use of nostalgia that is more positive and that is relevant here for the analysis of the novel by the British author Sarah Waters. So it's not working. Okay, great.
Okay.
Hang on. Here we go. Yeah, I wanted to first present this scholar that is important to me, and Brittany, and how she conceptualizes hope and how she deals with nostalgia, and then I want to apply it to the novel. Brittany opens by talking about how the field of memory studies has a traumatic paradigm. Because it sort of immersed in the midst of various atrocities, it ended up focusing on violence and trauma. And what does that do for our vision of the future, Brittany asks? And of course, we tend to emphasize what we don't want to see in the future rather than what we do want to see. So it highlights absence. There are declarations of nevermore. We mustn't allow history to repeat itself. And as a result, collective memory tends to enshrine grievance. And violence becomes at the core of identity, including in various nationalist narratives and myths. But Brittany believes that such a bleak outlook results from the collapse of all those grand narratives of modernity, which encouraged us to trust in the future and to foster utopian thinking. But what would it mean to have alternative modes of remembrance that don't focus on violence and trauma, but also don't fall into the trap of these triumphant narratives of progress, and are also not naively, blindly optimistic? So Brittany wants to discuss the cultural transmission of positivity. What would that look like, and where can we sort of try to trace it? We're still here. Okay, good. So to answer this question, she turns to a number of scholars who explore the political potential of hope. There's Alan Mittelman, who I think is relevant for this region, in fact, because he conceptualizes hope as a civic virtue, as a minimum condition for democracy. Because according to him, if citizens don't have hope in common institutions, liberal society will collapse. And I think that we have all witnessed apathy as sort of the dominant affect in the Balkans. So I think that his conceptualization of hope is very relevant for us. Among neo-Marxists, there have been attempts to sort of reboot utopian thinking in a post-1989 world, which is characterized by this complete lack of faith in the left and its political potential. I mean, not a complete lack, but a general sense of defeat. So Terry Eagleton talked about hope as a political catalyst that has to arise from a confrontation with reality, specifically this reality of defeat. But who is also interesting to me and very important for Brittany is Anton Traverso, who writes about left-wing melancholia. He's interested in oppositional memory. He wants to frame nostalgia as an act of resistance to the march of history, where we don't accept this defeat as being final, but instead we look at historical violence as a struggle for a cause rather than a tale of victimization. And he turns to Walter Benjamin and his concept of Jetzeit, but I will talk about this more later on. Now I want to see how Brittany applies her theory and where she draws from it. And she does so by doing a case study of the Paris Commune. As you know, in 1871, on the 18th of March, the Paris Commune began and ended merely 2 months later it was violently extinguished by government forces, killing 17,000 Parisians, with many thousands deported and sent into exile. And when the communards were subsequently granted amnesty, it was on the condition that the memory of the commune be erased. So that was sort of like the implicit contract in the name of national unity. So we all come together, we put the violence behind us, but the memory of the commune does not persist. However, various groups refused to go along with this plan. Socialists, communists, anarchists all took it upon themselves to transmit the memory of the commune and of its political potential. And in the process, they shaped a counter history to the official narrative. But the most remarkable aspect of the way in which they remembered the commune was they remembered it in a jovial, festive spirit, which was in stark contrast to the bloodshed in which it ended, right? It was violently repressed, and yet they treated it as a cause for celebration. So why was this so, and how did it work? Yeah, the Situationist International issued these theses on the Paris Commune in 1962, and I think that this is a very striking quote, which sort of captures their perspective on the Commune. Theoreticians who examine the history of this movement from a divinely omniscient viewpoint, like that found in classical novels, can easily prove that the Commune was objectively doomed to failure and could not have been successfully consummated. They forget that for those who lived it, the consummation was already there. So Rigney believes that this quote is the perfect illustration of Benjamin's Jetzeit. Jetzeit are those exceptional moments in time that are ripe with revolutionary possibility, right? And we can isolate them from the continuum of history and use them as a political engine, use them for inspiration, regardless of what came after. Of course, such an approach to memory is counter-narrativist in the sense that it refuses a coherent narrative with a beginning, a middle, and the end, where the meaning is determined by the ending. Instead, it isolates these moments and focuses on them. So for situationists, their recollection, as Rigney says, undoes the course of history by ignoring its outcome. And in this way, a counter-narrativist memory is formed. And to fortify such a framing of the commune, several practices were used. Instead of commemorating the commune on the date of its demise, they celebrated the date when it started, right? Because of this revolutionary potential embedded in the beginning. And they also emphasized the vision of the commune as festive, something which should be remembered through a party. And there was this vibrant commemorative culture that was established by those groups who cherished the memory of the commune, the anarchists, the socialists, the communists. These were commemorative meetings that were accompanied by music, singing, dancing, eating, games. They were scenes of communal pleasure. And for me, this is important because social harmony becomes lived, embodied experiences, an embodied experience in these commemorative efforts, rather than something that the commune is not mourned. It is instead celebrated. And when I was looking for possible ways to illustrate this presentation, I came across this poster, which was made to commemorate 150 years of the Paris Commune, and I thought it was the perfect illustration of this commemorative practice. As you can see, the artist has literally circled for us the emphasis, and the emphasis is on the protester, the emphasis is on the revolution. As we can see, the police are coming, so there is the intimation of the upcoming bloodshed, right? Violence will ensue, we see guns, but at the same time, we freeze frame on this moment, this picture of resistance, this picture of rebellion. And also, if you look at the composition of the image, the triangle draws the eye to the top, right? To this highest point of revolution. And the use of color is also used to reinforce this reading, as red is both a symbol of revolutionary fervor and passion, a symbol of communism, of course, and I would say a foreshadowing of the bloodshed that will ensue. But I think that the poster is interesting because it sort of encapsulates this commemorative practice that was nurtured for such a long time, that 150 years later, we are still thinking about the commune in this way. And now I'd like to apply what Brittany has said, and all these different scholars, to my analysis of Sarah Webster's debut novel. The novel came out in 1999. It's a coming-of-age story set in Victorian times about a young working-class lesbian whose maturation becomes a pretext for us to explore the lives of Victorian lesbians from different social strata. The novel has been studied quite extensively for its portrayal of gender and sexuality. The protagonist becomes a male impersonator. She takes to the stage. She's Nancy Ashley in real life, but she takes the moniker of Nan King as an obvious nod to drag kings. And it's such a delicious and delightful novel to read. I really recommend it, and some have called it like the fictionalization of Judith Butler's work. But for me today, I really want to focus on how Waters, as a socialist, tries to memorialize political activism, and that's the aspect of the novel that I really want to focus on. So we watch Nancy, this oyster girl from Kent, who joins the stage. She falls in love. She experiences heartbreak. She moves in with this super rich widow who is this upper class lesbian who lives in a very rarefied world of her own. And she showers her in expensive, luxurious goods, which is definitely not a fancy you should ever nourish for yourself. But it's also a very problematic relationship because there is the discrepancy in power makes for a very abusive dynamic between the two of them. Finally, she meets Florence, and that is sort of the combination of the novel. Florence is a socialist activist who is dedicated to helping poor women, and she attempts to unionize home workers in Victorian England. And when I say home workers, I don't mean domestic workers, right? These are not women who are, cooking and cleaning and taking care of somebody's kids. These are women who are making clothing, but for someone, but at home. They're monogramming of the clothing. They're making hats. So, but they work from home. So in that sense, they're home workers, and they're very vulnerable. And I would like us to read the novel a little bit because I think it's so delightful, and I think that I want us to sort of engage with the text itself. So Nancy starts to accompany Florence on these visits where Florence tries to educate and tries to get these women to become involved and to try to improve their condition, their living conditions and working conditions through collective action. I had begun, as I have said, to accompany Florence on her visits for the Guild, and on this night I found myself in the home of a seamstress at Mile End. It was a terribly poor home. There was no furniture hardly in the women's rooms, only a couple of mattresses, a threadbare rug, and one rickety table and chair. In the chamber that passed for a parlor, a tea chest was upturned and had the remains of a sad little supper on it, a crust of bread, a bit of dripping in a jar, and a cup half full of bluish milk. The dinner table was all covered with the paraphernalia of the woman's trade, with folded garments and tissue wrappers, with pins and cotton reels and needles. The needles, she said, were always dropping on the floor, and the children were always stepping on them. Her baby had recently put a pin in his mouth, and the pin had stuck in his palate and almost choked him. I listened to her story and then watched while Florence spoke to her about the Women's Guild and about the seamstresses' union it had established. Would she come to a meeting? Florence asked. The woman shook her head and said she didn't have the time, that she had no one to mind the children, that she was frightened that the masters and the outfitters for whom she worked would hear about it and stole her shillings. And when Antonia was giving her presentation a couple of days ago, and even before, it struck me how relevant and how contemporary this novel is for a historical novel. It speaks about poverty, it speaks about working conditions, and about the inability to bargain for yourself when you are caught up in this trap, and you certainly cannot do it on your own. You need the collective action to create change. And as they're talking, Nan remembers her life with the rich widow at Felicity Place, ironically titled, of course, because it was not a place of joy for Nan. It was an experience of luxury and of complacency, but not necessarily of happiness. So Nan approaches the table of the seamstress and looks at her work. She lifted her shirt and showed me its pocket. There was a flowery monogram upon it, sewn very neatly in ivory silk. It looks a bit queer, don't it? She went on sadly, seeing all these scraps of handsomeness in this poor room. It does, I said, but I could hardly get the words out. The pretty monogram had reminded me suddenly of Felicity Place and all the lovely suits that I had worn there. I saw again those tailored jackets and waistcoats and shirts, those tiny, extravagant NKs that I had thought so thrilling. I had not known then that they were sewn in rooms like this, by women as sad as Mrs. Fryer. But if I had what I had feared, I knew that I would not, and felt now horribly uncomfortable and ashamed. And these are exactly the feelings that we experience today, right? Faced with our own complacency and our own role in the cycle of consumption. We feel guilt and we feel shame. And I think that really what is so striking is how Water manages to write about the past, but at the same time write about our contemporary moment. And while she's faithful to the period, she's still, there's so much resonance in her writing. But she doesn't stop there. She wants to offer us the past as a blueprint for the future, which is why I think the futurity of her nostalgia is so relevant. And it's a blueprint which highlights civic engagement and political organizing. So let's look at this monologue that Flores gets. Things are changing. There are unions everywhere, and women's unions as well as men's. Women do things today their mothers would have laughed to think of seeing their daughters doing 20 years ago. Soon they will even have the vote. If people like me don't work, it's because they look at the world, at all the injustice and the muck, and all they see is a nation falling in upon itself and taking them with it. But the muck has new things growing out of it, wonderful things, new habits of working, new kinds of people, new ways of being alive and in love. As we can see, Waters is doing what the communards were doing, and the situation is, and everyone who was commemorating the commune, they pick a figure to embody civic memory. Civic memory emphasizes agency rather than being a passive victim. It zooms in on the active citizen, and Florence is this active citizen who is spearheading the unionization of female home workers. And in this way, she uses the past to facilitate the civic commitment in the future. And as you can see, again, this monologue could be spoken today, apart from the charming reference to the vote. This is still how we think about things. You know, we look at our mothers and our grandmothers and how their lives were different and how much we have moved forward, and yet at the same time, how much work there is still to be done. So I want us now to go towards the end of the novel, because I think that it's so wonderful how the novel manages to illustrate everything that Rigney and all these other scholars I talked about illustrate. And she frames the novel's combination as this workers' rally that takes place in a public park. And this is what she says. It did not rain that Sunday. Indeed, the skies above Bethnal Green were so blue and clear, we might have been forgiven for thinking God himself a socialist. The brilliant sun a kind of heavenly blessing. At Filter Street, we all rose early and bathed and washed our hair and dress. It was like getting ready for a wedding. I very gallantly decided not to risk my trousers on the crowd, socialists having such a poor name already. Instead, I wore a suit of navy blue with scarlet frogging on the coat and a matching necktie and a billycock hat. This is a very tactile, sensual passage that highlights color, that it's embodied. They're bathing, they're washing their hair, they're getting dressed. You can imagine the colors and the textures of clothing. And it frames politics as festive because it compares a workers' rally, a political rally, to a wedding, to a celebration. It's a celebratory view of politics, exactly in the way that Brittany outlined and described. And by choosing to frame this moment as the end of the novel, she is essentially doing what Benjamin talked about, you know, the end side. Let's talk about this moment of political potential, and let's end the novel here. Let this be the final word. And at the very end, then, all the ordinary people of East London would seem to be all jumbled together in Victoria Park, good-natured and careless and dressed in their best. They came, I suppose, as much for the sun as for the socialism. They spread blankets between the stalls and tents and ate their lunches there, and lay with their sweethearts and babies and threw sticks for their dogs. But I saw them listening to the speakers at the stalls, sometimes nodding, sometimes arguing, sometimes frowning over a pamphlet, or placing their name upon a list, or fishing pennies from their pockets to give to some cause. So what if paints a picture of communal pleasure, where, like Brittany said, social harmony becomes lived experience, and community engagement is embedded in everyday life. You know, they're sunbathing, they're eating their lunches, they're, talking to their loved ones, they're playing with dogs, and they're also being politically active. They're also putting their name on a list, they're donating to a cause, they're arguing with the speakers, they're thinking about these political ideas. And at the very end, to make the picture complete, Mrs. Fryer, the seamstress I talked about, does indeed join the union. And I think this is such a hopeful novel and such a hopeful message for us. And the thing that I found particularly interesting was that this novel predates the theory, right? I mean, it doesn't predate Walter Benjamin, but it certainly predates Rigney and Traverso and Eagleton. Eagleton published his book in 2015, Traverso in 2016. Rigney's text came out in 2018, but this is a 1999 novel. And, Mirella said that literature is radical, and I mean, it's the avant-garde nature of this novel, that she studied the tradition, the activist tradition. It was the activists who created this memorative practice, much sooner than the academics described it. And it was this novelist who then promotes it and sends this message, passes it on, pays it forward. And for me, I think that is the most hopeful thing about this. I talked to a fellow student and she was like, this is so important, how can we get the message out to the people? And I said, maybe we don't have to, because the people created this practice, we're just describing it. Thank you.